Welcome everybody here to what an amazing interior of number 12 Henrietta Street. My name is Charles Duggan, I'm the Heritage Officer with the City Council. And so on the eve of Pride Weekend, we're particularly delighted to come together for this conversation with Dr. Anthony Delaney, chaired by Dr. Ciarán Wallace, exploring his book, Queer Georgians, A Hidden History of Lovers, Lawbreakers and Homemakers. Before introducing Anthony and Ciarán, I have a few brief notes to share. The lecture, first of all, is an initiative of the City Council's Strategic Heritage Plan and made possible with funding from the Heritage Council. And through the series, we aim to amplify diverse voices, share fresh perspectives on familiar stories, and shine a light on histories that are less well known. We also aim to highlight new and innovative research that deepens our understanding of Dublin's architectural, cultural, and social history. If you've missed any of our previous talks, you can catch them on our YouTube channel, which is Dublin City Heritage, and where there's a very wide range of recordings on the city's built and cultural and social history. We'll be taking a short break in July, but we'll be back in August for another fascinating series of talks. These include Claire McCaig on the Jackson Harp, Craft, Commerce and Conflict in 19th Century Dublin, Dr. Gregory Walls, who may or may not be here tonight, on Dublin and the 1926 census, Dr. Freddie O'Dwyer, talking about the Duke of Ormond, his Dutch architects and the Royal Hospital Kilkenny, and Dr. Ellen Rowley on Modernism by Modest Means, exploring Dublin's 20th century architecture. And finally, Dr. John Gibney on what the archives reveal about why Ireland joined the EEC. So now to introduce, and before I introduce our speakers, I want to thank my colleague Abigail O'Reilly, Graduate Heritage Officer, whom you've all have met downstairs, for her work in helping to organise this series. And I also want to thank Cormac Leonard and Vanessa O'Connell, who are providing Irish Sign Language services for us this evening as well. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. We have Dr. Anthony Delaney, who holds a PhD in history from the University of Exeter, where he's an Honorary Fellow, and he also presents the History Lit podcast, After Dark, and Queer Georgians is his first book. And Dr. Ciarán Wallace is an historian of Dublin and a lecturer in Trinity College. He has published widely on Dublin's social and political history, Irish political cartoons, archives, and online learning. He is also director of the Virtual Treasury of Ireland. His most recent book, Meath, The Irish Revolution from 1912 to 1923, was published by Four Courts Press in late 2025. So over to you, Ciarán and Anthony. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles, and good evening, everyone. If you can't hear me, please shout and I'll shout louder. I learned a new word as we were sitting here today, which fits very well with where we're sitting on this warm day. Imagine people sitting here in the 18th century wearing a banyan, B-A-N-Y-A-N.
That's it.
On a day like this, no air conditioning, a silk overcoat come down to about your knees, and this the amount of clothing people would have worn in Georgian Dublin. So this adds maybe a colourful and perhaps a slightly odorous layer to our experience of Georgian Dublin and Georgian queers. So it's a great treat. I'm delighted to have the chance to speak to Anthony and ask him the questions I wanted to ask him. There will be a chance at the end for some questions from the audience, but I want to jump in and get as many questions as I can, first of all. And the first question I had was the idea of queer Georgians. So queer is a word we've reclaimed in modern times. So how do you apply queer to people who possibly didn't, for them, queer meant very different things, and did they even see themselves in that way? How did you come to that decision?
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? It's one of those things that you encounter very quickly when you go on any kind of a book tour, and you find yourself all up and down the UK and Ireland. And it's definitely one of the questions that people will ask first in a Q&A scenario at the end of a talk, for instance. And they'll also, well, how can you call people in the 18th century queer? They wouldn't have understood themselves like that, which is absolutely true. I find it interesting, though, that they never follow up that with going, how can you call them Georgians? Because they wouldn't have understood themselves as that either.
Sure.
So if you're applying that logic to queer, you also must apply it to Georgians, and you also must apply it to Tudors, and you also must apply it to a whole wealth of anachronistic terms that historians constantly use to try and describe the past. Because we are here in 2026, and we are explaining this history to you guys or to readers or to whatever it might be. We're not explaining it to the Georgians. So that would require a different set of linguistic skills that I myself do not possess. But thankfully I'm not there, I'm here. And so I think we'll talk about this, Ciarán, because we've spoken about it before, but we talk about burdens of proof that are on the historian. But I think we need to also acknowledge that the burdens of proof that we expect from, say, if I were a Tudor historian sitting here talking about Tudor history, you have to apply and give that same grace to people who do queer histories, even the term homosexuality or homosexual hadn't been invented. Because again, it's just a constant way that we communicate history now in the 21st century by using anachronisms. So, yeah, it's and you know, again, Ciarán, you'll know, but it's a very widely accepted academic term. I understand that it can be contentious for a lot of people, but here's the thing: if we don't use that, what are we going to use? And I think it's more important that we're telling the histories with as much good intention and archival rigor as we can, than we just find ourselves tongue-tied and saying nothing at all. So I think it's important that, I think it's a great question. I think the question should absolutely be asked. But that's my rationale for using it.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I find it very useful, and you use an explanation in the book. You talk about family, that we talk about family quite unproblematically today. We say the family in 1750, but the family in 1750 didn't mean a nuclear family as we might understand it today, or a chosen family as we might understand it today. So those terms do shift. I think that's useful. But you mentioned burden of proof. So what was your burden of proof for queerness? The whole thing, we look at someone and you think, is she or isn't she? So how did you decide who came in, who came out of the book?
Yeah, oh, they're apt terms coming in and coming out of the book. It's as if you've planned this. The thing is that I think with queer histories an awful lot, or histories that look at same-sex attraction or gender nonconformity as we would understand them today, one of the first burdens of proof that people expect you to prove is that people were having sex. Now, if you think about that, that's a really odd burden of proof to place on a historian. You would never say, well, let's talk about Churchill's sex life to prove that he was a straight man. You would just never do that. It's just a bit gross, actually. So for me, the burden of proof is, yeah, sometimes you do stumble across the Diary of Anne Lister, which is discussed in there. We'll talk about Molly houses, I'm sure, which of course Dublin would have had as well. And you will stumble across sex lives in there inadvertently because they'll come up in court records or whatever. I'm aware I'm talking very fast for the ISL signer, apologies. I'll slow down. But the burden of proof for me in describing these lives was intimacy. Who are these people spending the most important, most meaningful intimacies of their lives with? And that is supported then by the archival material, but there's a caveat. And that caveat is how we understand intimacy is not the exact same way as the Georgians would have understood intimacy. So if you come across a man who's sharing a bed with a man, that for me is not meeting the burden of proof. So you have to delve much further. It might be, depending on the context of where they're sharing that bed, it might be a spark for further investigation, but certainly that's not where proof stops. Yeah. And people often say to me with these histories, oh, well, you know, it's kind of, you're reading between the lines and you're interpreting things in a new way. And I always have to reiterate, I'm doing this history in the exact same way that you would study 20th century Irish history or any other historian, or else you wouldn't pass the bloody viva. Yeah. It's as simple as that. You have to meet certain criteria. So the burden of proof is the same as it would be for any other historian. There is no magic formula to queer histories. And to imply that there is this different way that you would do these histories is actually not doing the histories a great service, because it implies that we don't need the same historical burden of proof as historians, but of course we do. That's what the Academy we need to meet that burden of proof. Penguin wouldn't have allowed me to publish the book. You know, there are fact checkers that go through this. So it's the same way that historians do history all the time in different places, but it's just with a different lens on it, I think.
Well, this wasn't a setup, but you gave me the word lens, so that Do you need, or is it an advantage to have a queer eye for the historical guy or gal? Like, does that actually make a difference?
I actually think it's key. I think that's really maybe the only difference here, or when people present queer histories, is that, you know, there's this idea, particularly in the academy, I suppose, or within institutions, that you must kind of divest yourself of all personal experiences before you enter into an archive, lest you sully it with your personal life or your personal experiences. But actually, that's a silly notion to try and carry with you into the archive. You're not going to forget what your life experiences have been. You carry them with you all the time, but my steer is carry them with you. And therefore, it's important that queer people are in the archive, that more women are in the archive, that people of colour are exploring the archive, because every new lens sees something different that then prompts further experience. And of course, as I'm saying, that's not the end of your research. That's the very first step. It may prove fruitless. It may prove that actually that hunch that you had from seeing something in the archive that you thought you saw doesn't materialize into what you thought it might have been, because or you couldn't prove it, which of course are two different things. But it's a starting point that different perspectives, you know, it's that thing, isn't it, where if you're reading a book and you're from Mayo or something and Mayo is mentioned, you go, oh,
yep,
there's
absolutely.
Mayo, or like, I know that street, or you know, and there's just a familiarity that you have based on your own experiences that draws you to something that maybe somebody else doesn't see in the same way. And I think that's why the more people, by the way, you don't need to have a PhD to go into an archive. You can go into any archive. You know, the new 1926 archives are a great example of that, actually. There's been a lot of people going in, exploring those. But you can do that for the 18th century ones too. You don't need white gloves nowadays, guys. So off you go in.
Yeah.
So it's like they're there for everyone. And it's the more eyes on them, the better.
The book is a real fun read. And I thought it's a real challenge to get out of a PhD, which is one type of tool for proving your skill set and proving your argument, to write a book, which is actually as much fun to read. Was it that much fun to write? Because it feels like you're having a good time when you're writing it, and you talk to my dear reader quite a lot, and it's a lot of personality in the book. Was that conscious?
So my background before I did the PhD during COVID, because I trained as an actor, I worked as an actor, I still work as an actor. Harry Wiles season 5 is just out now. And I did the PhD during COVID because I thought that, well, we're never going to work again. That there's going to be no industry, so I'm going to do something else. And so I knew going into it that I didn't want to, so I still have my fellowship at Exeter, I teach public writing there, but basically it's a co-beneficial relationship. I don't lecture, I don't teach in that sense. I always knew it was going to be going towards something like this, presenting on the podcast. We're over in July filming a documentary about the Great Irish Famine. So it's always for public consumption. And yes, I could have done that without a PhD, but I didn't want to. I wanted to have the kind of backing behind me to show that I had done the work to earn it, you know. So, and yeah, you don't have to, but I wanted to.
I smile at the thought of you felt you weren't going to be able to get work as an actor because of COVID, so you went into history.
I know.
But I like
it worked out.
It worked out.
I'm getting away with it still, so it's fine.
Can we jump into some of the characters? There's people in this book that are just amazing. And to be honest, as we were saying earlier, you said you couldn't make some of them up because real life is more interesting than the people that you would ever make up. And one that really struck me is Peter Sawali, if I'm saying that name right, or Mary Jones. And can you just tell the audience something about this amazing character who is so resilient and such bounce back ability? It's remarkable.
Yeah. So Mary Jones is somebody we shouldn't know about at all. She is the first free black person in her family line in the Americas, in North America. She's in New York. She is a sex worker, and she is somebody who we would understand as having transed their gender identity. So she uses both names. She was born as Peter Sawali and lived most of her adult life, though not all, as Mary Jones. And she comes to our attention because of scandal, as you might well imagine. And The scandal is self-brought on to a certain extent because she, much and all as I love her, and I think she's probably my favourite person in the book, she's also an out and out chancer, like total thief. She appears, I think she was arrested, now you'll forgive me if this isn't the exact number, but I think she was arrested some 40 odd times for theft in a very short period of time. In over 10 years, and she's in Sing Sing prison. She's in different prisons throughout New York, and she's in those prisons as Peter, of course. And because she's arrested for theft rather than sex work, because the legislation she's arrested for vagrancy essentially numerous times. What happens is she's listed using both her names in the archive. So you get Mary Jones, and then you'll have in brackets Peter Swally, or you'll have Peter Swally in brackets Mary Jones. And we talk about when what we would now understand as trans identities are traceable in the archive, and people go to the 20th century, or maybe the late 19th century. But here we are in 1832, 1833, 1836, and Mary Jones's name is appearing in the archive in formal legal documents, sometimes on its own, sometimes alongside Peter Swally. And that's a remarkable landmark in the documentation of what we now understand as trans histories. And what's really special about it as well is that, often when you're talking about queer history, you say, oh, these are histories that people have tried to erase. And people are like, well, they haven't tried to erase them, they just maybe weren't seen. No. In the case of Mary Jones, I provide a picture of it in the book, there is a legal document, I think that one's from certainly the 1830s anyway, and Peter Swally is listed, Mary Jones was listed, but you can just about make out, and I think based on the markings it's a 20th century interference. Somebody has gone in with some form of rubber and rubbed out the name Mary Jones. So it's a literal erasure of this identity. But she was known in her time, again there's a picture of this in there, as the man monster. And the irony of that is, and she's in court this one time, and she's beautifully dressed. She's wearing the height of fashion, and the girls that she works with in the sex trade have styled her and given her all the different dresses that they don't need. And she's known for her style, Mary Jones is, and she's the pinnacle of composure. And then she goes into her trial for stealing. And the jury around her and the men that have come to watch, and it's not all men, but mostly men, she's standing there, she's listening to people talk about her, and they are literally grabbing the wig off her head as she stands there facing the judge. They're pulling the scarf from around her neck, and she's standing there trying to hear what's going on. Not trying to defend herself, because she did steal the stuff, like there's no two ways about that. But what comes out of it then is this idea that she's a man monster, and there is monstrosity happening in that room on that day, but it's not Mary Jones. She is the picture of dignity. She really is, the literal picture of dignity. She's standing there, and what I do love about her history is that we have all of these arrests, we have all this terminology around man monster and all of this kind of thing. But the last glimpse we see of her is in 1836, and she does disappear out of the archive after this. And she is known as, I won't explain this because it's better to read it rather than me explaining it, but she's also known as Beefsteak Pete. I'll preserve your dignity rather than explain it to you. But she's spotted walking down, I think Broadway maybe, in New York, and they're like, where did she get that hat from? This is a newspaper article. She looks incredible. And she kind of, for me, walks off into the sunset, She gets to have this hidden history after that. Yeah. Sometimes, we say, oh, the hidden histories need to be exposed or outed or whatever way you want to look at it. But actually, Mary never wanted the attention. So the fact that she then just goes, well, she did want attention, just not that kind of attention. But she then goes down Broadway to who knows where. Yep. And I love that for her, that, it could have been terrible, but why not imagine it could have been great and give her that dignity that she didn't always have in life. But yeah, she's a remarkable. Sometimes it's that thing of going. She didn't change legislation. She didn't forge a nation. She didn't, change the world as we know it. She just kept getting up every morning and going again and going again. And sometimes the great thing about history is that that's all it takes to make history. Get up, go again. And she does that. And
I think, and I've underlined that more or less exactly that line. It just takes just putting one foot in front of the other, and that's very impressive. The notion that when you're describing the court, and we come across so many queer people through the worst moment of their lives when they appear in court. In Mary's case, she appeared in court many, many times, but for some, they appear in court once, and that's enough to terrify them, or once, and that's enough to see them to the gallows, depending on the situation. But just to go to some of the grim parts of it, because some of the stories are grim. In some of the earlier chapters, you're talking about people who get as far as being executed. Did that have an impact? I mean, I know I've read cases of, like, you read a grim story of infanticide or a terrible injustice or something, and it does take your breath away sometimes in the archive. Reading about that, about this happening to other queer people, does that take something out of you? Do you ever have to take sort of, say, I'll stop reading for today, I'll go away and do something else?
I had that, and I'll tell you what, that came in a different capacity, actually, but not in terms of that, and I'll tell you why, which is good, because this is a Q&A, and I should probably answer some questions rather than just keeping it to myself. But that didn't take anything out of me because I expected it. Because that's what you're supposed to expect when you come to do queer histories. And so, yes, that is in there. But actually what I wanted to show ultimately, and those first two chapters are kind of the most bad for that, or the stripping away that somebody ends up losing their life. But actually, what you also find in these archives everywhere, including in the first two chapters, are family lives, chosen families, biological families, joy, camaraderie, queer communities in the 18th century, which, by the way, we were told, when I started my PhD, people were like, but there is no queer community. That was my PhD supervisor, who was a queer person herself, and just was like, well, you're not going to find that. And I was like, it's right there. Like, have you looked at this? And it really is right there. And so the joy that comes through countered that for me, because the joy was newer. You know what I mean? Like, the joy kept me propelled because it was less expected. And actually I was going, God, these people are having lovely lives, actually, and are very much part of their families and are very celebrated in their families, or even their ex-families. We have ex-father-in-laws coming in to testify for one of the guys, Gabriel Lawrence. But I'll tell you where I had to stop a few times. There's a man who's not that famous here, and rightly so in Ireland, called William Beckford. But if you're in any way clued into Georgian life, he probably comes up more than he probably should. And he was known as England's richest son. And he's one of the people who there's no real doubt over the fact that he was same-sex attracted, and he built this big mansion called Fonthill Abbey in Wiltshire, where they had, and these are their words, not mine, buggering parties, basically. And these loads of men would show up, and that's all well and good. But he also is diabolically unbearable to spend any time with, and he never stopped writing, and he's just miserable. He's just absolutely miserable all the time, and he's mean, and he's selfish, and he's an Egypt, and it's not nice spending time with him. And when you're there listening to him day after day, it was more for the PhD, and it was like, can I please leave this down? So he tired me out, but the negative stuff, no, I expected that. It's there. Yeah.
To be surprised by joy is a very nice thing.
Yeah.
So that's a really impelling thing. Is it Beckford who comments? He has newspaper clippings amongst his papers, and he reads an account of somebody who's executed for sodomy, and he describes it as the word bugger.
Yes.
And it's that interesting thing where he's a very privileged man. I might ask you about privilege and money in being queer in the past. But he comments on somebody who's been executed, and he can see, like, a fellow feeling. He can see a likeness, although they're separated by a chasm of social layers.
Yeah.
So he is afraid.
Yeah, he knows that people are leaving England to go to Europe. Yes, he had to see. Beckford also experienced an exile because he was involved in what I call the Fonthill scandal, which was he had some kind of a dalliance with the boy that became the 9th Earl of Powderham, and it was scandalous at the time, and he had to leave, and rightly so. It's one of the reasons why he's difficult figure to spend time with. But other men were leaving because they were having consensual relationships with men of their own age, and he was aware of those men leaving. And yeah, he clearly identifies with them now, and I use that term loosely, not in terms of identity categories necessarily, but he knows they're part of a wider experience, and that they would be, well, he calls them buggers, doesn't he? And when that term, by the way, he also uses this later on, that term, the poor sod, comes from the poor sodomite. So that's where the rest of that phrase is, and he's using that as well, the poor sod, which means the poor sodomite. So there's definitely this loosely shared experience, because as you say, the class chasm is wide.
Yeah, right. Can we bring it back then to Ireland? Well, to Dublin first of all, through the Chevalier d'Eon. So starting at the end of the Chevalier's life, the Chevalier d'Eon is a fascinating character who, what do you title the chapter? Is the God! I shouldn't have put you on the spot.
No,
the
never ask me any questions.
This chapter is amazing. It is called is that the Amalgamationist? No.
Yes,
the Amalgamationist. No,
I can't remember.
Anyway,
yeah.
Chevalier d'Eon is an entire book unto themselves, a fascinating character. But they end up performing in Dublin at the end of a very long career. But do you want to just fill in something about the Chevalier, how they came to be? We don't have time to the whole Chevalier's life, but as a teaser.
Yeah, God, it's a complex one. So the Chevalier was a French spy and politician and all kinds of things, and then later in life was a kind of a personality, a famous person. And so I tend to use would you believe, pronouns are even a thing in the 18th century. And the Chevalier uses female pronouns for herself about 45% of the time, and the other way around. Male pronouns 45% of the time, female pronouns 55% of the time. So I tend to try and balance it out like that, just as an explanation of why I'll be mixing. And he starts his life trying to become an ambassador. Well, starts his life in military service first, then tries to become an ambassador in England, is part of the Secret du Roi, which is initially Louis XIV's spy network. And when he's not given the ambassadorship, starts to blackmail the French crown, and the French politicians more so than the crown, from England. And so that stands as a fact, we know that. And then we also know that something strange happens in the 1770s, where the Chevalier is told to start dressing as a woman, and by the French crown. And there has been this kind of Google history thinking that this feeds into the idea that the Chevalier felt that he was a woman. But in the course, and there was people who would disagree with me on this, so do, like, if you get a chance, read it and do a bit of further reading as well, because, often history is questions. But from what I can see, what the archive shows me, is that the French government, realizing that the Chevalier's blackmail was going to undermine their authority, that they had planned an invasion of Britain, start to discredit him in whatever way that they can. And so they say that he was born a woman. And of course, if there's one thing we know about the Georgian period, you can't trust women. And so there is a trial held, it's a civil trial held in London to prove that the Chevalier was born female. And it is decided that the Chevalier, French doctors give testimony, French dignitaries give testimony. They say they've had sex with her, that they have examined her medically, and that she is biologically female. And so therefore, she's humiliated. She says, I don't know where this is coming from. My only guess is that I'm neither attracted to men nor women. And so therefore, they're trying to make my personhood into something. But she's like, but I was never born a woman. In the beginning, she's saying that. Then he wants to go back to France because he's been so humiliated in England, and the French court says, now we're on to Louis XVI, and Louis says, yeah, you can come back, but you have to be a woman when you come back. And he goes, okay, I'll come back, but I'm sure it'll be fine, I won't have to wear female clothing. And he goes back wearing male clothing, he's put under house arrest, and because he's in male clothing, and then they send Madame Bertin, who's the dressmaker for Marie Antoinette, to his accommodation in Paris to dress him in female attire. And from then on, the Chevalier spends a decent amount of time dressed as a woman. And so again, it's been thought that this was what we would now understand as a trans identity. For me, the archive doesn't show that in this particular case. For me, it shows that it's a control system that the French government are trying to place on him to discredit him. But he embraces it later in life because he needs to financially. He is broke. And he tries to sell his story, kind of can, but doesn't really. She starts making up all of these things about where she was born and that actually she was born female and she had to... An uncle was going to inherit, so they needed her to be a boy, so then she had to inherit. So it was all this real complex web of lies. But then when she dies, penniless, and I went to the room she died in London, and it's not this, put it that way. And they very, it's difficult, but they have an autopsy. And they published the findings of the autopsy, and he was born male. And they publish pictures of genitalia. They do the whole thing, and we have this idea now that why are people so obsessed with people's genitalia? It was there in the 19th century too, early 19th century too. But my findings were, and I think this is new, that when she was in Dublin, there was this idea that she always fenced in female attire. But I found playbills or announcements of the Chevalier's appearances in Dublin and in other regions around the UK that says he's appearing in male attire. So back in his Chevalier's uniform, appearing as a male. And people had thought that she lived the rest of her life as female, but now these playbills show, including the appearances in Dublin, that wasn't the case at all. As a matter of fact, we thought there were hundreds of appearances in female attire. Now, looking at it this way, we only have documentation for one ever in female attire, and that was in front of the Prince of Wales at the time, the future George IV. So that's not to say it was the only one, but we can definitely prove there's more. That's not to say it was, we have the documentation to show that male attire is touring rather than female attire.
And isn't it interesting that by that stage, the public have accepted that she is a woman, but she is a woman fencing. So what she's doing is fencing because she's a wonderful, what's the word, fencer? Swordswoman. But she dresses as a man. So this is, so if you think this person is a woman in the 18th century and they dress as a man and they fence, well, that's an amazing thing to see. But if this person 20 years earlier, 30 years earlier, had been a man who was a good fencer, that was not an amazing thing. It's a really interesting thing.
And the fascinating thing about it was the very first book event I had back in September when the book was launched was in Manchester. And there was a French historian who just happened to be there. And she came up to me afterwards and she was like, we don't tell this history in France the same way at all.
Really?
Gender doesn't really come into it. It's a military history that they tell. And so the legacy is you talked about this already, Ciarán, the legal implications have coloured this history. The 18th century legal case has coloured the way we interpret the history in this part of the world. But France, now look, they do in the museum in Tonnerre, where the home is, they have some of her gowns. Well, they have one actually. So it's not that they're unaware of it, but they don't categorise it in the same way.
So if the Chevalier is fascinating for pronouns and that whole pronoun debate, I presume what you were doing at the start of chapter 7, when you're going on to the Ladies of Llangollen, before they become the Ladies of Llangollen, you refer to Ireland by her female pronouns very nicely a few times. I think that's nicely done. You're inserting the Gaeilge in there.
Yeah.
But that story, the Irish roots of the story, the Ladies of Llangollen, much less known, I think.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't know the Ladies of Llangollen, there were two Kilkenny women where I'm from myself, who were made by their families essentially to go and live in somewhere but Wales. They ended up in a place called Llangollen. They became known as the Ladies of Llangollen, and they had this kind of domestic idyll that they set up for themselves there. And it's a beautiful, Place Nude is beautiful. If you ever get a chance, you should definitely go. It's a cottage, they call it, but it's a fairly impressive cottage. And it's so beautiful. And they built this life for themselves over there that made them incredibly famous. They were in all the magazines, the royal family sent them a pension, Wordsworth wrote them a poem, and it's all in there. And but when Anne Lister, Gentleman Jack Anne Lister, went to visit them, she said, and this is what started me on my research on them, she said, this is all well and good, and I want what they have, I want the life they have, but The real key to understanding them comes in the feverish dream called youth. And so I went, I'm going to go back to their youth in Kilkenny. And what you find there is an adventure story. It's mad. There are carriage chases. There's more than one escape. There's guns pointed at people coming to try and get them. These are two women battling a system and their families. And because when they go to Wales, they quieten down an awful lot. That's what they become famous for. But in Ireland, they're not quiet. And actually, we have a show with the Irish Baroque Orchestra all about the ladies in the Sugar Club on Friday night. Come along, 7:30. And it is, we have a Baroque and a harpsichord and cello. And I tell the story of the ladies, but only the Kilkenny portion. Because it is, I couldn't believe how much tempo and fight and escape there is in it. It's a brilliant adventure story. It's great.
But you tell it very well, and it is like a page turner, and you don't expect history books to be page turners. But then you mention Gentleman Jack and Lister, and Anne Lister. There's two things I'd like you to talk about with Anne Lister. First of all, maybe the commemoration plaque. And that as a story, because I think we all know the idea of a blue plaque of commemoration, and we've just come through a decade of commemorations here, and we know what it's about, or we think we know what it's about. But there's dangers in it too. So if you wouldn't mind starting from the commemoration bit, and then say why that, like, what happened to commemoration? Why is there a plaque outside this church in the first place? What's being commemorated?
Yeah. So, and it's not even the first plaque. So this is a church in Goodrum Gate in York. And it's York is a lovely city, but it's very small. And this is the church where, if you ever watched Gentleman Jack or maybe read some popular history books on her, you will probably have heard that this is the church where she got married, supposedly. And there is a plaque, a rainbow plaque, which is great, up on the wall saying, well, initially it was saying one thing, and then the wording was kind of contested, so they took that down and said another thing. And they're hedging their bets now, which is right, because it's not black and white. So Anne Lister, basically the claim was that she got married in this church in Goodrum Gate in 1820-something. Despite the fact that it, of course, wasn't legal. But
married
to Anne Walker. Her
That's
yes,
the key point.
another woman, sorry, yes. Yes. And so there was this thing. And, you know, it's in the TV show. If you see it, they go up to the altar together to receive communion. They're holding their little fingers together. They're looking at each other lovingly. They're doing all this. Is very beautiful. I love Sally Wainwright, and I really enjoy that show. But it's not historically accurate because we don't get our history from TV shows. And so what actually happens is, yes, Anne Lister thinks they're formalising their union in the church, but Anne Walker doesn't have a clue about it. Like and Anne tells us this in her diary. She says, I was thinking about it, but turns out she didn't have a clue that this was going on. So I'm not sure we can claim that it's a proto-wedding. Now, there are other same-sex marriages happening in the 18th century, absolutely. I'm not sure this is one of them because you'd need both parties to be part of it, I suppose. So yeah, it can be difficult with Anne. So I did a thing in Sheffield back in September, October, and because I write about Anne Lister in a certain way, sometimes not the nicest way because I think sometimes she's not the nicest person. I had to have 2 extra security guards come to the talk because the Anne Lister fans were not happy and they were going to stop the whole thing and all the rest of it. But it is, and I love that people love history, but yeah, it's a very emotive history for a lot of people because when you're told you have no history,
yes,
you grab onto any little morsel of history that you can find. But as our job as historians to maybe muddy the waters a little bit sometimes, I think she's more interesting because of how difficult she is and how maybe not straightforward everything was.
Oh, she's a fascinating person to read,
yeah.
and again, not pleasant. I don't know if I'd like to spend a huge amount of time in her company, but like as what she was doing in her context was remarkable.
Yeah, revolutionary.
Absolutely revolutionary. That reminds me then of the question of that, like I can remember as a young gay man wanting to know about these great gay people or queer people who'd gone before. So you have your Oscar Wildes and your whoever debate over Roger Casement and so forth. But they were kind of heroes, but then you do history and you realise no more heroes anymore. It's not really about heroes. Heroes are kind of dodgy because they fall off their plinths, or you find out something dreadful about them later, and you have a poster on your wall, and you've invested in the blue tack and everything. But but from that notion of like doing queer history, and then these are real people who had their own lives, and they weren't looking towards us, they were looking towards their own lives and their own security or domestic happiness or whatever. Anything, just to comment on that, and Lister might be an example, but like looking at the private lives in a way, the lives and private lives of the people in the past.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's full of the historian's favourite word, nuance, isn't it? It's that tricky word.
Get out of jail free.
Yeah, it is. Listen, I said this to Ciarán before, and I think it's worth bearing in mind when we're talking about any history, not just queer history. They owe us nothing. They don't owe us to be these perfect icons that tell us how we're supposed to live today. They don't owe us that. Now, nonetheless, there's plenty we can take from them, and there's plenty of inspiring stuff that I found doing this. Again, Mary Jones, but she's not a perfect person. She's ruining people's lives by robbing from them, you know? But if we expect perfection from these people, especially again in the context of their own times, then you're going to fall flat. And Anne Lister, she has two. It's not a coincidence, I think, although some people think it is. I don't think it's a coincidence that she has two women that she's intimately involved in under what we would understand as sectioned under the same family, two different doctors, but from the same family, in the same place in York. She is a patriarch. She is somebody who wants to uphold Tory values. She's a landowner, she's exploitative, she wants money, those things are all true. And when Anne Walker and her teenage love interest start to go off the rails a little bit, they're put into care. And her family oversee the teenage affair that goes into care, and she never comes out, she dies in care. And Anne Walker has what we would now understand as fragile mental health before she meets Anne Lister, but certainly it's exacerbated by Anne Lister. And the great thing is recently there's been a discovery of Anne Walker's diaries. Now, they're nowhere near as revealing as Anne Lister's, but what it allows historians to do is map them side by side, and you get a really different view of both sides of the relationship. So you get Anne Walker saying, my love is showing me the way throughout Europe. I'm paraphrasing, those are not the exact words. And Anne Lister is then going, I wish she'd shut up. She's so stupid. Why am I on this thing with her? And the answer is money. She is taking money from Anne Walker, and Anne Walker writes her will to Anne Lister writes her will to Anne Walker, but Anne Walker is rich. By any standard, she is really, really rich. Anne Lister is not at the time. It's a failing family dynasty before she injects the cash in, and it's Walker's cash. So it is, yeah, but that, again, that's fine. It doesn't make her any less remarkable. It doesn't make her any less worthy of our study, but it just, I think she's more interesting because she has all these different facets to her. But I'm not looking for heroes necessarily.
Yeah, I think that's, if you go looking for heroes, you'll always be disappointed.
Yeah,
because
ultimately.
There's always going to be.
Yeah.
But the notion that the two diaries are speaking of two different views of the same relationship,
Yeah.
I think that's, so everyone can relate to that, like what's going on in your partner's mind. Yeah.
And Anne Walker, the partner, is only recording the travel that they're doing together. In terms of the domestic space, Anne Lister tells us that Anne Walker, and this is a direct quote, fancies herself under restraint. So that's Lister telling us that Walker thinks she's trapped because she is trapped.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's difficult, but it's again no less worthy of our interest because of that.
Another couple, they're not parallel, but I think they're a fascinating couple, maybe more akin to houses like this, are Steve Fox and John Hervey. Hervey or Harvey?
I say Harvey, but it can be
Harvey.
both. Yeah.
I mean, they're wealthy, they're from an elite class. That presumably makes it easier to be queer in that society because they can move above the restraints of the law. But they set up home, they make a domestic life.
Yeah, they do the grand tour together. It's very like this, actually. I'd forgotten. So they have a place together on 31 Great Burlington Street, old Burlington Street now. It is one of the only surviving houses still in that row, and it's actually very like this inside, apart from the fact that it's now the headquarters for Manola Blahnik, so it's, decked out, which is quite camp in itself, yeah. And they're on the grand tour. They're very much in love. It's very clear from their letters. And Harvey says to Fox, don't think it impossible. It's going to be difficult, but don't think it's impossible that we might be able to replicate this back in England. And 31 Great Burlington Street becomes that possibility. Harvey owns it by lease. It's very normal to own a house by lease in the 18th century. These would have been owned by lease. And he signs the lease over to Fox, but stays in the house. And he oversees the redecoration of the house in the 1720s, which fits really neatly with what Georgian men would do just before their marriage to women. So they would redecorate their house in order to accommodate this new marriage. And Harvey undertakes that. He's married to a woman as well, by the way. Harvey is. Poor Mary, she is confined and unhappy somewhere. And he does this house up, and he says, look, I've done the carpets, the stairs is done, I've put the curtains up. The only thing it's missing now is a piece of movable goods of my acquaintance, which I expect home with more speed than I can tell you, or something like that, again paraphrasing. But the house only turns to a home when Steve Fox finally moves into it. And they have this domestic space in London then, just down the road from St. James's Palace, where Harvey is a courtier, where they can be themselves together and have that kind of intimate life together. But homemaking, well, that was the queer homemaking in the 18th century was the idea behind my PhD dissertation, and that's what fed into this. But it's definitely there. It's they're making homes together, they're building homes together. I don't mean literally building brick by brick. And they understand their relationships very much in the confines of, or in the possibilities of, traditional homesteads and traditional marriage. And they're using that language all the time.
And that idea of traditional, what I would have used heteronormative, but you're using regulated. So the cost of that heteroregulation is it's a cost on everyone in society, but it's a cost on queer people who can't live out their queer lives, let's say. But the partners, the wives, the opposite sex wives and husbands so we're following the stories of the queer people here, but many of them are married. So, and they have straight partners or heterosexual partners. Do you get any sense of their experience? Do they come through with personalities in the different stories?
Yeah, Harvey's wife is a good example. She's Mary Lepel, and she was the beauty of the Georgian court before she married Harvey. He was one of the other beauties of the Georgian court as it happened. So they were seen as a good match in one sense. But people were writing poems about her. Alexander Pope is obsessed with her. He's obsessed with everyone. And she would have been, everyone wanted to marry Mary Lepel, but Harvey got her because he was another beauty. But what ends up happening is she goes through this, what I call in the book, this kind of pickling process, where he marries her, uses her, has a cartload of children, by the way, but leaves her in the family home in Ickworth in Suffolk, away from the glittering court life that she was smart. She was really politically astute. But then he just pickles her in this country house in Ickworth that's falling apart, that's damp, that's mouldy. But what she does is remarkable. She's another one that I absolutely adore in it. She starts, and I know you won't believe me on this, you'll have to read the book to see it, but I have the letters to prove it. She starts this kind of co-spousal caregiving with his male partner. So she writes to Stephen Fox, and she says, is he wearing his coat? Has he eaten his... She never stops loving him. Yeah. He writes her out of his will by the time he dies, and he dies relatively young. She lives on and on and on. But she builds this beautiful relationship with Stephen Fox, and he accommodates her into their relationship too, because he ensures that Harvey goes home. Harvey doesn't want to go back to Ickworth, ever. So if Steve Fox goes with Harvey, he'll go home. So he will go back with her. And you can kind of trace it because they have a child nearly every time he goes back home, by the way. So she is fulfilling that duty nonetheless. And so, well, that's an exaggeration, not every time, but And so she really does come up with a plan. And she's writing, we have the letters that she's writing to Stephen Fox, saying, will you two be coming to Ickworth? Come home, bring him home. I'm worried about him. I'm thinking about him all the time. And then afterwards, she is after Harvey dies, she's in constant contact with who is now Stephen Fox Strangways, the huge Lord Holland, all kinds of things. He's really senior in English political life. And she has a great relationship with him. They're sending pheasants back and forth. She's teasing him all the time. She says, if you don't come and see me, I'm an old woman now, I'll come on my broomstick and, put spells on you, kind of a thing. And she seems to have some sort of a voice again after Harvey dies. She needs money. She's not well off because Harvey writes her out of the will, essentially. She gets the bare minimum that she would be legally entitled to, but nothing else. But she's a brilliant character in there as well.
And how, in the complete, the prison she was effectively put in for a while. That she was trapped into. I get a sense that she might be one of your favourites, but I was curious to think, as I was reading through, I was thinking, which of these people would I like to either go out for the night with or stay in and have a tea and a chat with?
Yeah.
Either or, two very different interactions, I suppose. Do you want to say who you'd have
So night out would be Mary Jones. I'm going out with Mary Jones.
I'd be scared and I'd go home early.
Yeah. I'd leave my wallet at home, but I'd go out for the crack with her, definitely. Sitting at home and having a chat would probably be Harvey, actually.
Really?
Yeah, he's a bit of a bitch, if I'm allowed to say that. So that would be fun. He would know all the gossip. He was best friends with the Queen. And so and that's how he garnered his power, by the way. It was a real female drive. And he was known as a member by other courtiers, not by himself, as a member of the third sex, by the way. They commented that there are men, there are women, and there are Harveys. Whatever he is, he's in there somewhere. But again, this idea that we have these 21st century woke ideas, they had them in the Georgian period. They might have used different words, but they definitely understood that there was variation and nonconformity, as we would term it. So there's this real, he's definitely the tea and chats. Who would you have?
Yeah, I think I would like to have a tea and chat with him for sure. And definitely actually Mary Jones as a night out, which was hilarious fun. But I'd like to have visited the Ladies of Llangollen.
I know.
I'd like to have gone on a visit. I don't know how long, I don't think they stayed up late, but I would have by the time
No, probably not. They'd be in bed by now.
They certainly would.
Yeah.
At a kind of basic level, these people none of these are campaigners, they're all living their private lives, they're not starting a queer rights movement, they're not changing legislation, they're just living their lives, and we're now looking at them, or you're now looking at them and gathering a collection of them together and saying, what does this collection tell us? Why does it matter? Why bother looking at queer history? It's interesting for us in this room, but what does it mean politically? Or does it have a meaning for today's political situation?
I think it's one of those things that, again, it feeds into that idea of the woke mind virus. Those are Elon Musk's words, not mine. Where that this is a modern concern. These things of gender nonconformity, same-sex attraction, all of this are modern concerns. And it's just factually incorrect. There's also this thing of the implication of saying those things, of course, is that the queers there is no history of queerness. That queer people, before Oscar Wilde, you might as well forget it. Yeah. And that feeds into this idea of what we're talking about at the very beginning about words. Well, sure, they didn't call themselves that, so you can't say it. So by saying you can't say it means stop, So it's something about realizing that they might not owe us anything as queer people and whatever they might have seen themselves as. Mollies, they might have described themselves as cot queens, COTQUEANS. All that explanations in the book. Robins were ROBINS, were masculine women who were attracted to other women. So they had terminology. But they might not owe us anything. But we stand on their shoulders, and by Christ, they're mighty shoulders.
Yeah. Yeah.
There is something very, in their ordinariness, there is something radical in that. And I think we'd be doing ourselves a disservice to believe people who tell us to walk away from them. You know what I mean?
Oh, completely. I fully agree.
They owe us nothing, but they still can give us something, despite the fact that they don't. So it's we're just as entitled, queer people are just as entitled to the access to those histories as everybody else. I mean, as Irish people, we can understand this. There are parts of our own history we have very little access to, and that's because people have told us it's not worth accessing over, whether directly or indirectly, over centuries. So, and that's left us with legacies of blind spots, of different things in our own history. Even on a most basic level, ask anybody who's researching their Irish ancestry what comes after, luckily I've gotten back to like 1820 or something, but that's rare. It's rare. Well, I had Ancestry do it for me, to be honest. That's part of the podcast. But and what we could learn if we knew a little bit more about who those people were. And so I think it's the same for queer people.
No, I think this idea of, is there a queer ancestry? Like, is there a queer DNA? Not DNA in that sense, but is there a queer inheritance, that sort of thing? I was thinking that the failed postulant in that Nazi drama, the Sound of Music, nothing comes from nothing, nothing ever could. But nothing, like the 1960s movement didn't come from nothing. It came from people who knew older queers and they knew previous queers and so on and so forth. Well, could I embarrass you by asking you to read a paragraph?
Of course, yeah.
At the end? There's an epilogue in this, which I think the book has an epilogue which brings together a lot of your arguments and positions it in today. And I don't know if we've got time to continue into the epilogue, but I think would you mind reading that paragraph? Sure. I think that's might be a nice place to round up the.
How long is it since I've read this now? Okay, let's have a look.
Well, to preamble, before this, I remind you what you wrote.
Yeah, go on, no, do.
But I thought you make a nice, powerful argument because you're looking at all this stuff in the 18th century and the early 19th century, but then you're saying how things have changed so much now. Like we thought was progress in the 1990s and 2000s, progress, and think the clock is turning back in so many parts of the world now, politically and socially and so forth. And then you kind of position the need for queer history in the moment now in that paragraph. I think that captures it.
It sounds like I knew what I was doing at the time, so let's hope that I remember it. No, so it says, this is part of at the end, as Ciarán was saying, following this litany of legally enforced oppression across centuries, it feels increasingly difficult to find what we have determinately sought, where possible, in this book, inspiration and hope. But it is my belief, as a historian, that in the face of these aggressions, our queer past matters now more than ever. For the people who promote these laws are the same people who would deny us our histories. And why would they deny them us? Because these histories are powerful.
I think that's a remarkable tribute to the book. If you haven't read it, go out and get it. Go to your library and get it. Make sure your library buys a copy of it. I think it's a super book. If Charles is around, can we move on to take some questions, Charles? Is that?
Go ahead.
Yeah. If there's any questions from the audience, or have we covered everything?
Who's going to be brave? The first one is always difficult. It's always that thing of going, no, not me.
I suppose we're talking about having an understanding of this history, and I think one of your talks before, it's brilliant, it's amazing. As actually as we were walking here, I was discussing it and telling the gang that we were with. But then I wonder, would you also have suggestions of like follow-ons after this period of like what is a good like trajectory to move ourselves through Victorian and early 20th?
So there's a book called LGBT Victorians, I think it's called, which is a bit more academic, but it's a good overview. There is also, there's a lot really. I mean, Penguin want me to do queer tutors, but I'm not doing it, so I'd love to take you back. So you're not going to get that one from me, I'm afraid.
How far would they ask you to go back?
I was like, when does this stop? So LGBT Victorians. I also really like Fanny and Stella, which is very London-centric. Now, this also brings up a problem for queer Irish histories, particularly if you're talking about queer Georgian Irish histories. And Ciarán was kind enough to send me through a thing during the week about a sodomy trial in Kilkenny. Well, the man was from Kilkenny. So it's not like it's not, and this was in the Dublin Gazette in 17...
late 50s, early 60s.
Yeah. And so it's not like we don't have these histories here. they haven't been accounted for in the same way because of some of those things I was hinting about who's keeping the records at the time. The ways in which it's being tried as well is slightly different here. It comes up a little less, actually, particularly in that early 18th century. And that would be interesting to discover why. So the Victorian one there, Fanny and Stella, is another one. Irish, you're only really going to start getting it. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Ciarán, here, but like...
The 20th century.
Casement, I mean, it's a big, in terms of Ireland specifically, it's a big old gap. And it's not that it's not there, you know, it's just that the research is, the archive is more scarce, but...
There are two 20th century books just out now. So Tom Hume has a book out, Belfast Men, which is fascinating out of a single diary, really. And Avril Earls has Love in the Lave. Don't love the title, but it's about prosecution of gay men between before 1970s, let's say. But it's about out of police files and court files. But they're very 20th century. But you're right, there's a gap between. Like we know they were there. Women and men were both there, but where are they?
But here's the other thing: we do a great line in exporting queers from Ireland. So we have Dr. James Barry, who is a gender non-conforming Irish surgeon, world-class record-holding, was one of the first people to perform a surgical caesarean section in the continent of Africa from Cork. We have there's a book called Vicious and Immoral, and it's about an Irishman who was in the American Revolutionary Army and was tried for sodomy. The whole book is about him. Of course, we have Wilde then later on. But again, people often don't really celebrate Wilde as an Irishman. Like, it's a real... this is a bit of a name drop here, but I was at a dinner with his grandson recently. I know. And the family vehemently see it as an Irish history. Absolutely see it as an Irish history. But we do, but he's not a Joyce. You know, in terms of how we hold on to things, and the English see him as English, like he's theirs as far as they're concerned. The Ladies of Llangollen again, these are two Irish same-sex attracted women. We're exporting them all, you know. Graham Norton, no. We have a legacy of doing it, I suppose, is what I mean. So the history is there. It's just this kind of idea of export, which is a bit painful actually in some ways, because, you know, I talk in the book a lot about family and how important some of these queer people are within their families. But what we see with the Butlers in Kilkenny and the Ponsonbys also in Kilkenny is get out. So sometimes it's not all plain sailing.
Absolutely. And you have to find your records elsewhere.
I wonder at the time, say the Georgians, there would have been a revival in like classical architecture. Was there a period of fascination they would have had with, say, Greek or Rome in terms of relationships?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is in the PhD now, it's not in the book because it's quite theory-filled, but it is my theory that based on what you're talking about there, that kind of neoclassical resurgence, which you can kind of attribute to many things, but the real growth structure in the UK now, but in England, comes from William Kent and Lord Burlington, so 4th Earl of Cork. And there is a fairly vast archive to show that there's quite a bit of queerness between those two fellas. And they're obsessed with penis-shaped things and writing to each other about them. And they talk about homes, making homes together. And that's all feeding into this neoclassical Greek and Roman thing. And then you have the Grand Tour, of course. So that's where elite men in their very early or late teens, early 20s are all going to Italy or, you know, ending up in Italy throughout Europe and retracing some of those great sites, that great art, and they're sending it home to here, and it would have landed on this very road, this very street. Some of that loot, and that is certainly part of that tradition. There was a thing in England specifically, less here. And this is another thing that comes back to your question, actually, about the difference between same-sex attraction in the context of Catholicism and in the context of Protestant religion. Same-sex attraction in the 18th century was seen as a very Catholic vice. And so when they were in Italy, the English wanted them to come home pretty swiftly because God knows what they're getting up to over there, and then it'll stop when they come back to England. But obviously, in some cases it didn't. So very much linked to the idea that what are these men doing when they're over there together alone? There's no women, there's no wives. To guide them through and keep them. And, it was also in relation to female sex workers, but also in relation to same-sex attraction. And definitely there are models of male intimacy that are being replicated based on some Greek and Roman models, yeah.
Maybe one more. Sorry, Charles, yeah.
Organised privilege. It's just picking up on the last question, and I never mentioned it in our chat the other day, that James Gandon, the great classical architect, he is buried in Drumcondra, and I really recommend people go and visit this. And he's got quite a large recumbent grave slab, and he's buried with his friend, who is the antiquarian Francis Gross. And we know Gandon was married. So I think there's an interesting thing that has never been teased out. So if there's any young aspiring budding historians in the audience.
Yeah, that's a real good example of one of those first step things that I was talking about earlier, where you go, that is unusual. That's not, we talk about like hand holding for men in the 18th century was quite usual, linking arms was quite usual, kissing other men was quite usual. So those for me are not queer flags in terms of the historical sense, but that's unusual. Yeah. So that would be, that's a first step. Who knows where it would lead, but certainly an interesting first step, yeah.
Could we come back in 2 years' time, Charles, and have a talk about the historian in the room who will have a talk on outing Gandon? So I think you'd never quite know. I think we might have taken much of Anthony's.
Fine.
So can I just ask you to give Anthony an applause again? If you haven't read the book, please do.